mostly students, or will there be external followers as well? Who do you expect to be in the audience, just so I have a
Yes, actually, this session is open to all. So along with the students, there might be some of the media professionals as well. There might be media educators as well. So.
Okay, and about how many followers are you expecting?
Right now, I can just check it out. Sir, can you check how many participants right now we are having till present? Yes, I guess it's 20 right now.
Okay, yeah. Just in terms of if there are time for questions, I'll try to limit. I certainly won't use all of the time, and leave it to one of you maybe to handle any questions or Q&A, just to moderate that.
Mm-hmm. I just want to know whether you are going to do the PPT presentations. Is there a
no PowerPoint or no slides? No.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Because then we had to share the sharing rights with you, so that was the reason I was just asking for the same.
No, we'll keep it simple. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, yes, it's 6:28, and we are expecting almost like 80 to 90 participants at least. Yes,
okay.
Because yes, I mean, there were more than 100 registrations for this session.
Okay, no, good to know. Just in terms of how to moderate, what to expect in terms of questions and how to moderate. But I'm sure you have it all under control.
And I want to tell that these are the students who are the panelists. I mean, these are the first year students. So
okay, excellent.
Yes. So and this is the 22nd media monitor session. So in this media monitor discussion forum, we basically invite media professionals, media educators, and the people who are working in, working for the community media. So the reporters or the on-ground reporters as well. So yes, and we are really very happy and very delighted to have you here on this forum with us.
Perfect.
So it's 6:29. So at 6:30 we will start, and we could just wait for 2 to 3 minutes more so that other can join. And I want everyone to, get the benefit out of this session. And I know that they are going to have many takeaways from this session.
Good. Looking forward. Ready to go.
And I have with me Professor Zubair Khan, sir. He is my colleague. So he is a very dynamic person, and he is always there. I mean, whenever we are having any of the technical glitch, so he is like a supporting pillar to us for the same. So students, along with me, students will be the panelists. So after your presentation, after the discussion, the 30 minutes of your discussion, we will open the forum for the rest of the 30 minutes. And then the participants, along with the panelists, will basically can ask the questions or the queries they are having related to our topic. So rest of the 30 minutes, we will yes. So it's 6:31. So Harsh.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Now I will request you to kindly proceed the session. You may start.
Yeah. Good morning to you, sir, there, and good evening to all who have joined us here in India. On behalf of BAGMC Electronic Media, Department of Mass Communication of Prestige Institute of Management and Research, Indore, I, Harsh Vijayvargiya, welcome you all in a discussion panel for Media Monitor. We will discuss about the various aspects of media and its impact on individual and society. Today, we will be focusing on the subject human rights and challenges of tackling online content, posing a threat to journalists and democratic space. We have with us Scott P. Campbell as a keynote speaker for the day, and our panelists, Professor Bhavna Pathak, Professor Zubair Khan, Isha Verma, Mahak Jain, Trisha Nimbalkar, and Ashwin Matthew John. Before we move ahead with the session, I would like to give a brief introduction about our keynote speaker. Scott B. Campbell is Senior Human Rights Officer of the United Nations Office of the Human Commissioner for Human Rights, where he leads the work on technology and human rights in the Silicon Valley area. A US and Irish national, Mr. Campbell holds a degree in Master of International Affairs and a Master of Public Health from Columbia University. He has served as Africa Section Chief for UN Human Rights in Geneva, responsible for the work of the UN's Human Rights Field Presence in West and Central Africa. From 2011 to 2014, he was the representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in the Democratic Republic of Congo and has spent a total of 11 years living and working in Central Africa. Prior to joining the United Nations, Mr. Campbell worked with international and local NGOs for over 2 decades, including Human Rights Watch and the International Human Rights Law Group, where he was responsible for programs in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Europe. He served as US Peace Corps volunteer in the Central African Republic from 1987 to 1989. It's an honor to have you, sir, with us on Media Monitor. We welcome you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And my thanks to Professor Pathak and the Media Monitor, and my thanks to Professor Khan and BHMZ Electronic Media, and of course to the Prestige Institute of Management and Research. It's really a pleasure to have this opportunity to discuss, I think, what is really a pressing problem for all of us, and a problem for which we don't have to go very far to see or to experience. Persistent, growing online attacks against journalists, against students, posts that incite violence against human rights defenders, Facebook pages that are inciting violence, discrimination based on ethnicity, based on race, based on caste, based on religion. All of these, I think we are all too familiar with. These have become very commonplace features of the internet. At the same time, we're also seeing governments and companies that are removing legitimate content from Facebook pages or suppressing Instagram accounts of political opponents. We're seeing labeling by some governments of any form of criticism online as hate speech or threats to national security, removing it, and in some countries imposing criminal sanctions on users and those who have posted. Often we're seeing content staying online that should come down, and often we're seeing content that should come down staying up. So who should decide when and what content companies are leaving up or taking down? This is a very brief introduction to today's subject, of course. How do we combat online content that threatens journalists or threatens democratic space, civic space, threatens our human rights online? How do we do that while protecting our freedom of expression, our freedom of association online, of keeping the new public square, the new online digital public square, a space that's really free and open for all of us to use? So before I dive into a quick word about myself, and thank you again for the very kind introduction. I would put in just a couple of footnotes I think that are important, and in full disclosure. The first one is, I'm not an expert on technology, and you probably picked up on that from the introduction. Most of my background has been working with civil society, with human rights NGOs, and in particular NGOs in Africa, where much of my career has been spent. Secondly, again, full disclosure, I'm not an expert on India, and I've spent only a limited amount of time doing research in India, in Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and in Bihar, looking at human rights issues, and in particular looking at the impact of large infrastructure projects on local communities and serious human rights violations related to caste and land rights. But I'm far from an expert or up to date on current issues in India, although I do continue to follow some of the legislative developments related to data protection and privacy. But after many years in civil society, I joined the United Nations in 2006 and did focus most of my work on Africa, But what I wanted to stress was it was only 3 years ago that the head of the United Nations Human Rights Office, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, asked me to make a radical shift and to shift the focus of my work to digital technology and human rights. And this shift, I think, very much reflects a shift in the priorities of the United Nations towards digital tech and human rights, and both looking at all of the new challenges that new technology and social media are posing for human rights, as well as looking at all of the opportunities and the new benefits that digital technology hold for our human rights. So I'm now working across the United Nations system. I work with the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. I work with different parts of the United Nations, such as UNICEF or UNESCO or UNDP that you might be familiar with. I work directly with governments. I work directly with United Nations country teams around the world, including our country team in India. And I work directly with tech companies such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Google, interacting and advocating directly with them. And importantly, a lot of our work is done in partnership with civil society and with local NGOs and national NGOs. My work is essentially advocating both with governments and with companies to have human rights be at the center of their thinking about policies, about legislation, about regulatory frameworks for the development and the use of digital technology, including how the online space is governed. So I'm very pleased today to spend a little bit of time with you to address really one of the crucial challenges that digital technology pose, the challenge of online content moderation, of how to protect online civic space. But I'll speak to some of the solutions and some of the ways forward from the perspective of the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Office, where I work. And I will try to keep my remarks somewhat limited and also somewhat informal. And hopefully we'll have, I look forward to hearing from the panelists and seeing the questions that may arise from the discussion. To begin, I think we've all seen over the past years just how digital technology has really revolutionized how we receive information and how we share information. And I think this is even more apparent for those of us that are over 25 or over 35 or over 45 years old. Really, the way that we're communicating, we're receiving information has radically changed. And as this has happened, technology companies and governments and regulators have faced a whole new set of challenges. And while initially a lot of these challenges and debates were around so-called harmful content and looking at illegal content online, such as copyright infringement, copyright protections online, online child sexual abuse, now the debate over the last 5 to 10 years especially has really shifted to how do we prevent the spread of extremist content online or so-called terrorist content online? How do we combat hate speech online? How do we address misinformation and disinformation online? And there are many examples, I think, of this, and we don't have to go too far to consider them. Online attacks against journalists and human rights defenders are something our office deals with on a daily basis, an hourly basis. Sometimes it feels a minute-to-minute basis around the world. It reminds me, a couple of years ago, our office, the UN Human Rights Office, invited the very well-known Indian journalist Rana Ayub to the United States to come speak in front of the United States Congress on her experience as a journalist in India and the very vicious attacks that she was subject to. There are many other forms of online incitement to hatred, incitement to violence and discrimination. And we're all, I think, familiar with attacks against political opponents. Anyone with a critical voice coming from civil society or academia. Minorities, attacks against LGBTI leaders, against religious leaders, ethnic, many attacks based on race, based on religion, based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And in parallel with that, we've seen, I think, just how serious the use of social media and misuse of social media can be, and really the catastrophic results of that. We don't have to think too hard to consider Myanmar and the role of Facebook in Myanmar in inciting what our office considered a textbook case of ethnic cleansing and possibly genocide. The massacres in Christchurch a couple of years ago that were live streamed on social media, mass killings there. The manipulation of elections around the globe, most elections, I would argue today, being subject to some form of attempts of manipulation through social media. Disinformation on health and disinformation on COVID-19, for example, having direct impact on people's right to health and on their right to life. There are many other examples of very serious human rights violations that are taking place in the digital space. But just to illustrate, I think, how serious this challenge is, and of course has led to so much public outcry that something must be done. I think there's broad agreement and there are widespread and growing calls for something to be done, and in particular for regulation of social media and tech companies, and a broad consensus that regulation, in fact, is desperately needed today. And while there may be broad agreement that some form of regulation of what we see on the internet is needed today, and that companies certainly shouldn't be left on their own to sort that out in terms of content that we see or content that is removed, there are many questions, and good questions, about how we should go about regulating that online content. So what's the way forward here? And let me speak just a little bit to level the playing field a little bit. What are we talking about? What is content moderation? When somebody posts, when you or I make a post, or when we search for content on online platforms, the company is managing that process, and the company is deciding how information is stored, how information is made available to us. In some cases, the companies are deciding whether the information should appear at all or whether it should be removed. And in some cases, companies are determining in what order and what priority posts or information may appear in our newsfeed or in other people's pages. And as more and more people are using the internet and accessing information to express their views, to protest, or to mobilize others, how private platforms and how governments are restricting information, or how they're incentivizing certain kinds of posts to appear and to go viral, is having really just immense consequences, and sometimes that are really a frightening proportion in terms of the impact on public debate, public participation, and freedom of expression and freedom of the media. Let me outline just 5 of the main challenges that we have encountered, or we have noticed when governments do go about trying to regulate online content. And I should underscore, it's really not a simple issue, and it's a very challenging space for regulators to try to sort out. How do we regulate this space in a way that will combat some of the unlawful content, and also the lawful but awful content that's out there, while protecting freedom of expression? The first challenge, 1, the business model. Social media companies, quite simply, are out to make money. Their services to you and I may be largely free, but they are out to make money. Their most significant revenue is, of course, through advertising. Advertisers, in parallel, of course, want their ads to have as many views as possible, to sell as much of whatever their product is. So they're looking for views on the social media sites. And this in turn means that the social media companies want you and I to both visit and to stay on TikTok or on Instagram or on YouTube or Facebook, Twitter, whatever. They want us to stay on those sites as long as possible and to be seeing their ads as long as possible. that leads to this first problem of the business model, where companies will resist any kind of regulation that may limit their ability to attract eyeballs, as they say, to keep eyeballs on their platform. This is the first challenge, is that pushback from companies against regulation. The second challenge are poor definitions of what constitutes unlawful content, or what constitutes harmful content, or as I said before, what is awful content, but maybe lawful content. And here there are there's a lot of need to look at nuance, context, and the finer points of language. Many laws established in a variety of countries have sought to outlaw very poorly defined categories of harmful content, or extremist speech, or hate speech, or in my own country, fake news in particular. Although we've seen this around the globe, where fake news is defined as illegal. Now, these laws are often, they're based on very loose definitions of, well, what is harm, or what is hate speech, or what is fake news, and without providing evidence of the effectiveness of actually restricting this kind of online speech. And so the lack of clarity has made it very difficult for the companies to give you and I clear rules on what is permitted, or what they will take down. And I should note that there are no universally recognized definitions of hate speech. For example, terrorist content also is subject to question. What does that actually mean? As an example, within the United Nations recently, our own Secretary General developed a global strategy and a plan of action on hate speech, and how the United Nations should be countering hate speech around the globe. Even within the United Nations, there was disagreement on how to define hate speech. It's a little bit of our inside politics. But importantly here, vaguely worded laws on online content can really have a chilling effect on democratic space, on fundamental rights, and on our freedom of expression and our freedom of association online. A third challenge is often many of these laws that are being developed, or have been developed and imposed around the globe, they put the responsibility to moderate content on the companies. And they impose heavy fines on the companies if they don't quickly remove content that may be illegal. And these fines are often in the millions and tens of millions of dollars, as we've seen in certain cases around the globe. So imposing these liabilities, very heavy financial liabilities, and sometimes criminal liabilities, as is the case in Australia, for example, where CEOs of companies can be held criminally liable for content appearing on their sites. This means there's been a transfer of the responsibility to implement restrictions on expression to the private companies. So it's no longer the government adjudicating or implementing the restrictions, it's the private companies doing it and bypassing our justice systems. But often what we see are the platforms themselves are really ill-equipped to make some of these decisions. It's very complicated, as I just pointed to, and the business incentives of wanting to keep our eyes on their sites, but at the same time wanting to avoid heavy fines, may lead them to filter our content, user-generated content, to filter it and to censor it, rather than take a risk of a user posting content, the company leaving that content up, and then being heavily fined by a government due to it being classified as illegal. A fourth challenge is, and relatedly, many of the legislative efforts, many of the laws overemphasize takedowns of content and put this really as the central option to deal with content that may be somehow undesired by government. So this overfocus on removal of content is very unhelpful, and in fact is potentially counterproductive, as attempts to simply suppress some types of information by certain leaders, especially prominent political leaders, those attempts to suppress or remove their content may actually attract more attention through other means to the content, to the speech of those individuals. And depending on the context, other measures, such as giving prominence to reliable information in the face of disinformation about COVID-19, for example, but promoting reliable fact-based information on health, for example, or flagging certain posts with footnotes, noting that this information has been proven to be false. Flagging information while leaving it up may be more effective in combating those trends. A fifth challenge that we've seen in this very complex area is companies relying overly on artificial intelligence to do their online content moderation, relying on AI. And they do that to manage very large volumes of content. Facebook is dealing, of course, with literally billions of posts on its pages every day, but relying exclusively on AI to moderate content is often a go-to method for the companies, as relying on human content moderation is much more resource intensive and of course is much slower than having an algorithm, some AI simply decide what is hate speech, what isn't hate speech, making a decision to keep the post up or to remove the post. But AI is particularly problematic when dealing with complex form of speech, and such as I mentioned, such as hate speech, which are extremely difficult to define, which depend very much on context, on use of language, on subtleties within regions and within dialects. It's extremely complicated, and the use of AI can lead to a high number of mistakes being made in the content moderation. In particular, one of the dangers, and that has been documented, is using AI to moderate content may actually reproduce and amplify biases that we see in society, prejudice that we see in society already. We see often those biases baked into the algorithms or into data being used to train systems, and thus we see a reproduction and amplification of existing biases and discrimination within society. In particular, we've seen that in, for example, the use of AI hate speech detectors have led to a lot of have led to racial bias in the detection of hate speech. So given these challenges and many other challenges I think that I haven't touched on, what's the way forward in regulating online content? How can governments create legislation that protects civic space, protects our space for democratic debate, dialogue, for our journalists to post blogs, to put out controversial views, to criticize government policy or to raise a controversial point of view? How do we do that in a way that also protects journalists, protects human rights defenders, and protects voices of dissent from online attacks and online content, other online content that may incite violence, incite hatred, or discrimination? And so I'll end with some of our recommendations coming from the United Nations Human Rights Office, coming from our perspective on how regulators and companies can go about trying to legislate in this very complex space. So the first recommendation is to anchor laws on human rights. And fortunately, we have an international human rights law framework that exists and has been, through a number of international treaties and covenants, accepted by governments around the world. The vast majority of governments have signed on to this international framework. And this is the only recognized transnational set of rules and principles on freedom of expression. And as such, this should underlie regulation in an area, of course, where we need coherence across borders, as these companies, of course, are operating at the global level. International human rights law is based on universal principles. It crosses borders and cultures and is agreed to, as I mentioned, by virtually all United Nations member states. So this gives common ground both to governments and to tech companies that are trying to deal with the challenge of how do you regulate this space across borders, in particular from the company's perspectives. So international human rights law is really the underlying foundation. Secondly, we recommend to focus more on the process of content moderation rather than focusing on pieces of content or individual posts themselves when trying to moderate online content. So instead of trying to combat different types of speech or specific words that could be harmful but are very hard to define, regulation should focus on platforms' processes that determine whether and how content is amplified or restricted or removed. And so this would include how companies approach content moderation, making their processes on content moderation very transparent, very clearly set out in their terms of service, in their guidelines, and importantly, creating effective channels for users so they can easily and effectively challenge restrictions. If they're posting content that is removed or restricted, they have a remedy, they have a grievance mechanism that's easily accessible and effective. And also making sure that content that is either inciting violence against them or inciting discrimination against them is also subject to an effective appeal mechanism or effective grievance mechanism to raise those concerns. But the point here is that rather than trying to regulate specific content and individual pieces of language, companies should focus on the process and making that process very understandable to users and open to all. Thirdly, when regulating content or trying to regulate content, avoid ambiguity. And this gets back to an earlier point that I made. But while process regulation is preferable to content-based approaches to regulation, as I just mentioned, any attempts to regulate content on platforms should be based on laws and clear and unambiguous definitions. And this gets back to the problem of attempting to define hate speech and attempting to define terrorist content. Any restrictions to expression must be necessary and proportional and defined in law. Fourthly, consultation with stakeholders. I think this is really, really central. And unless regulatory processes have benefited from really meaningful participation of civil society in the design and the evaluation of regulatory institutions and regulatory instruments, it's very likely we will end up with flawed outcomes. I think too often regulatory efforts rely on very opaque or speedy processes where only companies and state authorities are involved rather than civil society. We saw this in Australia after the Christchurch massacre, where after that horrible incident, the government reacted, I believe within 48 hours, a very short amount of time, with a new law that indeed had very vague provisions in terms of what type of content was permissible or not permissible. And very problematic legislation passed in a non-consultative manner, and thus ended up being, and is today, still quite flawed. Fifth, ensure attention to context. So given what I was saying before on how expression is always deeply contextual, and decision-making on speech really necessitates a solid understanding of the social, the cultural, the linguistic nuances, regulation requires very adequately resourced human review of content moderation processes. And this shouldn't be exclusive, but it should complement the automated content review that is often done by AI and must be done by AI given the volume. But that human element for content that is flagged by users, that is raised in a grievance mechanism, that human element is so important for, I think, effective channels of communication with users and with communities. And we simply can't have companies have regulation that allows companies to rely exclusively on AI to do the content moderation. Sixth, require transparency. And this I've touched on before, but it's just so crucial that full transparency on how companies and states are intervening and interacting regarding online content is key to enable effective responses. There are some companies that publish transparency reports on what requests they're receiving from governments, for example. But often these transparency reports from companies offer selective or aggregated data and don't get us down into the detail of what types of requests governments are making on companies in terms of requesting user data, specific information about user pages or user posts or user location or personally identifying information. There's not enough transparency in regulation, and not enough transparency required in much of the regulation that we see today. Seventh, and my final recommendation is ensuring remedies. And any measures to block or to limit online content, in our review, should be subject to scrutiny. Users should have effective opportunities to appeal against content-related decisions that they consider to be unfair, whether it is allowing another user to keep up a post that is perhaps inciting discrimination or violence, or whether it's against content that they have posted that could be considered legitimate speech but has been removed by the company. And while companies' procedures can and must assist in solving immediate problems and addressing those immediate questions of content, what's up and what's down, independent courts should always have the final say. And there's these questions of what is legal, what is not legal online must not be left solely to the companies. So in conclusion, I'm sorry I took a bit more time than I had intended, but it's such an important area of work for our office, and one of just growing concern. I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Yes, the recommendations which you are telling, I mean, those are really very important. Please continue, sir. We want to listen it. Yeah.
Okay. No, I'm wrapping up. I'm concluding. I've really just tried to outline, I think, how both companies and governments, how they face these significant challenges, and there are many gaps that exist, in the current approaches to addressing online content, and that further action from both companies and governments is urgently needed. Clear and transparent human rights-based approaches by companies in developing and implementing their online content policies are key, and in parallel, governments need to keep human rights at the center of their efforts to develop legislation and rules, regulations to meet their obligations to protect people from human rights abuses that may be committed online by companies. So I will close with that, with my thanks again to all of you, and hand it over to the moderators. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. I think it was a very good 30 minutes for us. We also have questions for you. Just like in the beginning, you said that there is no generalized term for what constitutes a hate speech. There can be varieties of hate speech according to the people, and changes from place to place. So my question to you is that, according to you, what constitutes a hate speech? What do you think that constitutes a hate speech, as well as that can there be a way that we can generalize this term hate speech overall the globe, like on social media platforms, whether you're an Indian or you're an American, then the hate speech that is generalized, the definition, so we can regulate the content. So what's your take on that, sir?
Yeah, so my take is, indeed, there is no one universally recognized definition that can fit this. And as I mentioned, even the United Nations has tried recently, and our own Secretary General has produced a definition of hate speech. But as I mentioned also, that definition is actually contested. Some of us feel that definition is a bit too broad, and too much speech could fall into that definition. What we would argue at the UN Human Rights Office to sort out this question is to refer to international human rights law. And there are international conventions that can help to decide what is hate speech, what is not hate speech. And I don't want to get too legalistic, but there are Articles 19 and Articles 20 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that give us some guidance in terms of what is free speech, what are our rights to freedom of expression in Article 19, and in parallel with that, Article 20, which says that speech that advocates for incitement to hatred, incitement to violence, incitement to discrimination should be prohibited criminally. There should be criminal laws to incite that. That gives us the legal framework that sometimes is helpful because it's very solid, and there's a lot of jurisprudence around those articles, but doesn't concretely mean anything, to most companies or users like you and I. So our office has developed a tool, a one-page guide to help determine what type of speech should be prohibited by law, and it's a six-part test, essentially, that was based on global consultations in trying to interpret these universally accepted law of Article 19 and Article 20. And then this one-page tool asks those analyzing hate speech to look at 6 different aspects to try to determine, well, was this something that incites to violence, hatred, or discrimination and should be prohibited as such. So these are the tools we have to deal with, and rather than attempting to give one universal definition, we have one universal framework for states, for companies, and for users to try to address that question. I hope I answered your question, at least in part.
I'm also curious to know this, that you were talking about the content moderation, which actually the big companies do, and there is no transparency in that, right? So what could be the role of civil society so that this content moderation could be transparent? And it could be, as you talked about, the human intervention, that it should not be based on AI. So, yeah.
Exactly. No, there's a very important role for civil society to play, and that civil society is playing vis-a-vis the companies to push them to be more transparent about how they're going about the online content moderation. And I should say that I think there's been some progress over the last, really the last 18, 24 months in how companies are opening up more to civil society and taking their views more seriously. Unfortunately, a lot of this is due to gross negligence, and I'll put it in those terms, by Facebook in Myanmar. But I think it gives a very good example. As early as 2015, 2016, and 2017, civil society groups were writing to Facebook, were advocating with Facebook and saying, the way you're moderating the content in Myanmar is promoting incitement to violence, is promoting discrimination against Rohingya, is promoting all types of violence. Facebook, those calls fell on deaf ears at Facebook, and Facebook was really unresponsive until 2018, when a number of reports came out, including over 400-page report from the United Nations, which caught their attention. And really, since that time, Facebook has realized they have a business risk if they're not paying attention to the human impact of speech that they're leaving up, speech that they're allowing, that the costs to their company will be very grave. So since 2018, Facebook and the other social media companies have been much more open to civil society. And when civil society, academia, journalists are interacting with companies, often in coalitions through different international NGOs and national NGOs that are teamed up, the companies are starting to listen. They're starting to shift their policies. But as I alluded to, there's so much more to be done. but civil society has a very important role in insisting on this transparency, which is beginning, and most of the companies do have their policies. Their so-called community guidelines or community standards are accessible on their websites. They're increasingly based on human rights in terms of what they're allowing, what they're not allowing, and how their policies are shaped. So I think there's a crucial role for civil society to play, and it's one that's getting some traction. There's so much more to be done, and in particular, I think by the governments that are trying to legislate in this space as well, and the companies are open to hearing the voices now, but there's still just so much more to be done in terms of actually crafting legislation and laws that will protect us as users and protect us as individuals online when we're promoting our views, while not suppressing the space we have. Mm-hmm. It's a very fine line.
Right. Thank you so much for your insight. There is one question from one of the participants, Krisha, and she wants to ask why removal of content is not the solution. And I mean, what else can be done? We simply cannot leave those things floating around the internet. So your take on it?
Sure. So some content is clearly illegal and should be removed, and it should be prohibited under international law and under national law. Example there would be child pornography or child sexual abuse, or promotion of a terrorist movement. This type of content is illegal. It should be regulated as such and simply removed. That's very clear. The trickier space is, as I was saying, the content that's awful that we really don't want to see. Perhaps, or some of us don't want to see, but it's not actually illegal. And this could be perhaps somebody insulting, from where we sit, somebody insulting the Secretary General of the United Nations, or somebody, calling a president of the company a certain name. The problem is, if regulation says, well, just remove that, you're opening the gate to governments declaring any kind of criticism as hate speech. Well, we should remove fake news. We should remove hate speech. And what you have then is, let's say, a prominent journalist putting in a blog, well, I think the government's policies, the Ministry of Development is entirely corrupt. And I have evidence saying there's widespread corruption in the government. If the regulation says, well, hate speech is illegal, without defining hate speech, the government can simply say, well, that criticism, that's hate speech. You're inciting hatred against the government. Therefore, that's illegal. We remove the content, and also we can put you in jail. So simply removing can often lead, to suppression of the space. What we're seeing is more effective are other methods that I touched on very briefly, but such as putting a filter on content or labeling content. And we saw this in the United States during the presidential period of 2020. We saw Twitter and Facebook initially not removing content by former President Trump, but labeling it as non-factual, saying this information cannot be proven, or labeling it saying for alternative sources, you may want to go to these websites. But rather than simply removing, as ultimately, of course, these platforms did remove President Trump, but the danger there is that users such as him and many other users, if you simply remove their content or suppress their account, ban their Facebook page, they'll go underground, if you will. They'll go to the dark net. They'll go to other fora where perhaps there's even less scrutiny. There's less awareness of what they are saying. So in some ways, it's better to keep that information in the public space, as awful as it may be, but rather counter it with positive speech. So rather than removing the speech, countering it with fact-based speech, with other opinions, promoting more expression, rather than simply removing it. It's a great question.
Sorry, panelists. I mean, there are questions from the participants, and so I'm just asking it, because we are having like 50 participants. So one more question is from one of the participants, and she is Priyanka Ramchandani. She is asking how to increase credibility in the age of internet, where there are multiple identities.
This is a real challenge for the companies. By multiple identities, I'm assuming the person asking the question is talking about inauthentic accounts, inauthentic behavior. And this is something that's almost all the social media companies have banned, and yet they've proven less than effective in suppressing multiple identities. And we've seen this in electoral contexts. We've seen multiple Facebook users that are fictional created who will become great champions of the prime minister or great champions of a political candidate. Most of the companies have made this, inauthentic behavior and fake accounts against their rules, but there still is a huge gap in trying to actually track them down, as it's so easy to create these false accounts. And there was recently a woman who defected from Facebook with quite a lot of attention, as she said her efforts within the department of Facebook that was responsible for detecting fake accounts, inauthentic behavior, influence operations, that their efforts were very much subject to the business interests of Facebook. So essentially, Facebook was being made aware of fake users, of fake accounts, people creating propaganda and trying to influence elections or people's opinions. And Facebook, being aware of that, was still saying, well, it's in our business interest to keep these accounts up and running. We might upset a prominent political leader, we might upset a president, we might upset a prime minister if we remove these fake accounts. So it's a great question as well. And the companies, again, while they have policies that do make inauthentic accounts illegal, the implementation is still very much lacking.
Thank you so much, sir, for your answer. Now, I'll request the panelists, if they are having the query, they must be having so many questions in their mind. They may proceed now. So we still have we are still having only 9 minutes only. So precisely and concisely ask the questions. So we will take only, 1 or 2 questions. Yeah.
So I had a question for you. So nowadays, apps like Snapchat, Instagram, and so on, they all use facial recognition, and even some services use them for encryption as well. So hypothetically, if that data is breached and that data is mixed with CCTV coverage all around the globe, that could literally become like a God's eye. So what could be the future repercussions in the long run if this happens?
It's a great question, and it's one of the reasons why the United Nations is so concerned about digital technology. You've really put your finger on it. The implications of a lack of regulation and a lack of control over these digital technologies, and you touched on facial recognition technology, which we haven't talked about, but when you're mixing a lack of regulation on facial recognition technology, on data privacy and data protection, and the use of social media, we have a very, very volatile mix and a good prospect of a very dystopian future. I think the answer, or the attempt towards an answer from where we sit is looking at governments around the world, reminding them they have obligations that they've taken voluntarily. They have internationally, legally binding obligations under international human rights law to protect people's rights. And in that case, the right to privacy, their right to be free from violence, their right to be free from discrimination. And that the governments need to urgently address questions of regulation of the technologies you mentioned, of facial recognition technology, regulations around the right to privacy, data protection, and privacy in the digital space. They urgently need to address these issues through legislation, but again, legislation that's very carefully crafted to protect rights, and not to create opportunities for governments to use these new dilemmas as excuses, essentially, to create legislation that's very loosely defined and that can lead to suppression, to really a chilling effect on civic space. But to use, to combine digital technology, facial recognition technology, a lack of protection of your data, and the massive amount of your personal data that may not be protected on social media, to combine that and indeed create a very, very controlled and dystopian future. It's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking.
I have one more question. Actually, I was just saying, like, this session was open for all, and we are so happy that one of the PhD scholar from JNU is with us, and he is Mr. Alok Pathak, and he want to ask one question. He's saying that in recent years, the attacks on journalists highlighting loopholes of the government or the corporates has increased dramatically. So has UN come up with any mechanism to deal on this issue with the governments?
Yeah, and so the issue is the attacks against journalists who have been critical of government policy, or is that right? Yeah. So if I've understood the question correctly, so the UN is advocating very much for a human rights-based approach to how governments are regulating freedom of expression, the online space, and incitement. So indeed, we've seen a huge increase in attacks against journalists and others that are critical of government policies. And we've been engaging often through UN country teams and through our leadership to advocate for governments to make sure there are laws in place that protect people online who may speak out and hold critical views. And the journalists, such as you said, we're looking at perhaps government loopholes or government corruption or other issues. So our approach has been very much to push for legislation that on the one hand makes it clear that certain types of online content are illegal, unlawful, and should be prohibited, very clearly defined. And yet the vaguer laws, the loosely defined terms must not be incorporated into legislation, and it can lead to unwanted either suppression of content or worse, arrest and criminalization. As we've seen in many countries, bloggers, journalists have been subject to arrest and long imprisonment based on very loosely defined laws.
Yeah, thank you so much. So it's almost like 7:26. I know, I mean, it has been almost an hour. So I request Harsh to kindly sum up this session.
Yeah, I don't have words to express today. So it's been a very helpful session for all of us. In the beginning, where you expressed yourself and even enlightened us with all what's going on right now and how we can combat this. I'm short of words right now, and it's been a really wonderful session for all of us. Thank you so much for coming and giving us a precious time. We, on behalf of Prestige Institute of Management and Research, BHMC Electronic Media, we thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Before closing the session, I want to give one more introduction of Scott Campbell, sir. And I want to disclose this, that, it has been almost like 20 years. So when I was in, in 9th standard, actually when I was in 7th standard, so Scott Campbell sir came to Singrauli, and Singrauli is known as, the energy capital of India. So he was there, he was with Human Rights Watch at that time, I guess. So sir was there to know about what are the human rights violation over there in Singrauli. And he gave me a wonderful opportunity to visit to US, and he supported me a lot. And with his help, I was in US for summer school program, and that was Phillips Exeter Academy. And after 20 years, I would like to thank to LinkedIn, through I got the connection. And here we are after 20 years, long time. So
Thank you so much, Professor Pathak, and
so it's a kind of, I mean, it's a nostalgic moment for me. So
well, it's a fantastic opportunity for me, and thank you, Professor Pathak, for doing this. And I also have very fond memories of the research we did in the Singrauli region on those very, very grave human rights violations that were going on at the time there, and perhaps some of which continue today. But I just want to really say just how important it is, I think, the work that you're doing as professors in this field, and to you, the students, the crucial role that you have and you will have if you're going forward with a career in media, in journalism. But your role in protecting freedom of the media and freedom of expression will just be crucial. And so I hope today we've at least given you a few ideas and maybe some tools or even a bit of inspiration to work towards keeping that space for yourselves as future journalists very open and very free. So thank you. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, sir, for your valuable time to us. It was a wonderful session, very insightful, and so many takeaways from this session for all of us. I'm thankful to all the panelists. I'm thankful to Harsh for moderating this session. Thankful to Professor Zubair Khan and all the participants for being with us. Thanks to everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.